I'm still having kind of a spotty experience with the headset. So if it's crackly or inconsistent, like the noise canceling is pretty good, but then at the tail end of the last video, I hear like this kind of scramble, like this tinny kind of scramble. So I don't know. It wasn't a very expensive headset, so I'm just getting experience with the noise cancel. I don't know how new that technology is. I should Google it, but it's pretty cool that it's cheap. I just don't know if it really endures. Anyway, so I wanted to rant semi quickly about the Putin situation, the president of Russia doing the invasion in the Ukraine. And the reason for that is like it's a lot of overlapping. I don't want to be disrespectful and compare it to like a Hitler thing, even though it's the Vladimir Putin seems influenced, like he wants to copy the historical actions of, like almost an amalgamation of Hitler and Stalin. And he's doing some, it's almost like a very impressionable, schizoaffective person. Not that I'm a medical person, but we watch these Batman movies and we see these crazy villains. And, we have a little pop psychology awareness of some of these disturbed people that really are affected by the movies they see. That was my impression about some of our, you know, experiences, our national tragedies. It just seemed like I'm not saying they were faked. I'm saying the perpetrators seemed like they were enacting a bad Die Hard plot and things like that. But I think just the self awareness in real time, to use the expression, you know, to have it going on. You recall like when you're in school, when you were in school. I was in school 20 years ago, decades ago, and just always the impression of World War II and Hitler. You always looked at those people like you felt bad for them, but they had a little bit of an alibi. There wasn't the media saturation that there is today. And back then you could be a little bit ignorant and not necessarily be ignorant. You would just be disconnected from what goes on in the world. Nowadays, there is media saturation. It's pretty much in your face. And a lot of people choose not to look at, the news. They feel it's, gory and, meetings grabbed with the violence. And I just feel like that's a little bit of a betrayal in civic duty. Because, whenever a Republican president does something in the Middle East, there's a lot of support for that a lot of the time. And I think it's a little bit based on racism. Sometimes it's important to do it because there is a terrorism element, but sometimes it is in alliance with some of these oil people like Vladimir Putin, who has that kind of geopolitical policy of destabilize, or it seems that way. It seems like he has that policy of destabilize and sell marked up oil. But you get into the situation, and I always looked at people who lived during the Hitler times, like how embarrassing it must have been for them if they had really kind of known the situation, the scope of how bad it was. And here we're in this situation where we know it's bad. I mean, we know about 70% of it, and what we don't know could be unspeakable. And the things we already know are almost unspeakable. And it's in a narcissistic sense. It's an affront. I understand it's selfish to say, well, I'm embarrassed that this is going on in, my lifetime, that there would be such a tyrant that could be able to pull off such a thing while many of us who consider ourselves reasonable maturity emotionally. That's it. Then we can. There could be some sort of movement to diffuse such destruction, and yet you know what's going on. It's like just being in a bad movie. You can't effectuate change. It is embarrassing because we know full well the scope and our excuse as well. You know, I won't call it an excuse, but our reasoning is, well, he has very destructive weapons. He absolutely does have very destructive weapons. I don't mean to belittle that. But, you know, Chinese have destructive weapons. I think they can be reasoned with. For some reason, we just can't get through to the regime in Russia. They're committing atrocities and they're committing what looks like terrorism on a daily basis. And, you know, just for an American, the dichotomy, I don't know what the word dichotomy means, but just the paradox of you have a pretty good living standard in the Western world, and even in the parts of the East, they have a good living standard. But we have barbarity going on, and it's completely anachronistic, and we're kind of powerless. Like there are different ways to analyze the situation. It's truly, truly bizarre. You know, um, I'm trying to almost refrain from saying certain things on it, but it's completely baffling. It started out terrible, still terrible in a way we didn't really expect it because it persists, and it's you know who knows if there's an end to it. And you wonder about the strategy of the Ukrainians, if they're doing it correctly, because they seem a little bit green, like a babe in the woods. They don't really have that Machiavellian way of reacting to the Russians. There's some other countries like the Danes or somebody else would probably be more tactile. And it just seems like the Ukrainians are giving them a straight up fight. But I don't know that it's so perplexing. But yeah, there's also a lot we don't know. Like, what is the situation fully in Russia itself in terms of they've taken people, and you know, there's a lot of things we don't know. And you know, just as a citizen of America in a developed nation, to be so powerless with our government trying to do the right thing, but then getting a pushback from your fellow citizens. Oh, it's too much money spent there. Well, in a way, but I think it's kind of a fair or valid impression to look at some of the global terrorism that's gone on and wonder if it hasn't been more of a coordinated thing, you know, an alliance. So when you talk about spending, well, are you going to walk into a trap and spend? Wasn't that really what Afghanistan was? Wasn't that really what Iraq was? And some of the, you know, that's kind of what it seems like Vietnam may have been. And then somebody in the CIA or what have you, apparently the favor was paid back in Afghanistan with the Russians going in there and having a terrible time of it. And it was almost like they revisited Vietnam. And then, you know, during our George Bush years, we end up in Afghanistan, we end up in Iraq, and now it's almost like the Russians are doing that cycle over. Instead of being in Afghanistan, they've now gone into Ukraine, and it's just so bizarre. It's very difficult to read the situation because you really get the impression at first it was Putin's ambition. The train whistle is going off, and I want to just document that in case the noise canceling is doing what it's supposed to. But it seemed like Putin's ambition to invade, but then his population is mad at him because it's been inept and it hasn't worked accordingly. It hasn't. It's been extremely destructive. Devastation in terms of human life has been really unspeakable. And at least by Western standards, not by those Eastern standards apparently, but I think even China, I mean, they're really keeping up a good poker face. But if China's not disgusted with that, although China has experienced a lot of, it seems like, we don't know, we don't have very transparent information. It seems like China may have experienced a lot of grisly casualties of the pandemic. Oh, we're not really sure about that fully. But you have Russia inflicting heinous violence and casualties and absorbing them themselves. And it just, like I say, it's completely anachronistic. I know there's probably parts of Africa and various places where there's very ugly genocide going on. And, we haven't had very good leadership to intervene in the ways that I guess Bill Clinton attempted to. Bill Clinton attempted to do gooder stuff in Africa and like Tanzania or Rwanda or whatever. The situations where the Black Hawk Down incident happened and things like that. Bill Clinton got stuck into nation building accusations and things like that, and those things can go wrong. You need a very specific way of trying to help those situations, and I'm not sure that's down to a science. It seems like you can try to airdrop food on people who need it, and then possibly try to militarily confront governments that seem destructive. But if we weren't doing that, I think we were at the time putting boots on the ground, occupying. And when you occupy, you're obviously vulnerable and susceptible to terrorism, and like sort of Vietnam style. So, we really have to try to stay out of those situations, or if we get into them, there has to be a better approach to trying to feed the citizens without necessarily occupying lands like that. And, when you have a moment of clarity, you step back. I mean, it's terrible that Ukraine has to experience this. And, it very much destabilizes global markets and it affects everybody. But the Americans who would say something like, well, why are we funding that country? Well, you're going to end up spending that money because either you're going to walk into a trap or you're going to address the real source of who sets the traps. I mean, the only flip side would be, and then I'm attempting not to say anything too outlandish because it's a very sensitive topic. But basically, war machines grow from these dysfunctional, inept conflicts where we just don't achieve what we're trying to achieve. The war machines were like, well, look how bad that went. We got to be prepared. Obviously, we have to be prepared. There's a lot of danger. But at the same time, and I'm not sure we've been successful at anything in quite a while. It's like those old Mike Tyson fights towards the end when he was beating up tomato cans. And even those tomato cans started taking down the guy who had gotten a little bit of age on him. Even the tomato cans were dangerous. So it's a question. I mean, technology is obviously progressing. And how much of a factor that will be is, I'm not sure lay people like myself and most people will really understand how much that'll shape the situation. But this has been a cycle where it seems like Russia's back in Afghanistan unless they do something drastically terrible. But it's ugly. And it's embarrassing for the world because, people say go on with your life. And people do. I mean, I do. I'm not the healthiest, so I'm not like bouncing around, trying to joke around. But then you see it'll be the lead in the news. It's like every day or close, they're having something similar to a 9/11 experience, and to try to joke around too much in media. I'm not talking about professionals, but some aspiring person like myself trying to joke around. I just feel like a douchebag, but sometimes I'll do it just to sort of participate. There are domestic issues that require, you participation by civic-minded citizens. You know, not requiring authorities on or experts on subjects, but people who are, you know, emotionally invested in the well-being of our country. That's all it is, civic-mindedness. And then sometimes you get caught up and you want to joke around on the topic, or in your newsfeed you're going to see sports and you react to it, and then you have some chance at levity. But I'm the person who really tries to go pretty zany with that stuff, and yet now to do stuff like that, it really feels like you know you have these people like Sean Penn, and in past decades you look at Sean Penn, this guy's pretty intense. But this is a very immediate problem, and he's had the right intensity about it. He really means well, and he's just disgusted with the situation. And a lot of people in Hollywood are. Ben Stiller, and a lot of these people are just like, God damn. And I don't think for a second any of these people are like jumping on a soapbox trying to exploit it. I think they generally want to go about making their art, living their lives, being, pretty social and extroverted. But I think they just a lot of times feel like a real scumbag moving on when it seems like this dire Hitler situation. Like, obviously, in the 1930s, Hollywood did its thing. People did their lives, even though Hitler was going on. There was World War II. They had baseball, this and that. They had diversion. But at the same time, there wasn't the media saturation and the 24-hour news cycle of the heinous things happening. And they're bad. You feel bad for people suffering through a winter and some of the specifics that we know about. It's not the news shouldn't cover them. They should cover them. But you have people better than ever at just tuning it out, because other sociopaths, professional media sociopaths, probably working for Putin's media arm, saying to them, well, come on, what about the U.S. transgressions in the Middle East? It's like, no, we didn't. Terrible things happen in war, true, but no, we didn't take any land. The motive was not to take land. It was to try to stabilize situations and bring to account people that were destructive. That was always the U.S.'s motive, and it's a different motive in the Russian-Ukraine invasion. It's it's just a person who has to be just absolutely sick, and if that's reflective of the whole culture, because they're certainly not overthrowing him. It's not a Mussolini situation. They're just like they're mad that he's not doing it effectively, expediently, and that's pretty crazy. I'm sure there's a percentage that are ashamed, but they're not. They're not laying out because I guess they know they'll be murdered. They'll be murdered, I think. But you have a lot of people who just they have a nation of 100 million, what have you. So maybe 60 million, maybe 45 million might have reasonable education. So then you might have like 20 million or so with some sense of conscience and reasonable education. And they're just not able to pressure their government to pull back despite the deaths, because they're observing a lot of deaths. And yet, meanwhile, we sit here in the West, and we're those people. In some ways, we're worse than those people in World War II, because we see the specifics of some of these incidents. And yes, the weapons now are ghastly in terms of what, Putin's army may have. But, uh, really sitting around ineffectual to influence the change. It's a session of just a breakdown in human civility. It's really sad. We don't really state it, but the level to it is the weapons. We're bucking. Our government is trying to help the situation, and thinking through the '90s and what happened. I mean, I know geopolitical person. I don't know what that word is. There's a specific name, but my understanding is they signed a treaty, and Bill Clinton in the '90s, '94, Bill Clinton twisted the Ukraine's arm to paid them probably 700, 800 million that I read, if not billion. I don't know if I have that. I think it's 800 million. And Ukraine had to give up their nukes. Now they didn't have the launch code, surely. God knows if they worked. But they were functionally dirty bombs that could have been used in a war. Ukraine didn't want to give them up. And regardless of whether or not they gave them up, they didn't proliferate. They didn't reacquire new nuclear weapons, which they could have, but they didn't. And instead they built some power plants. And this was after 1986, when there was Chernobyl, and that was all sketch stuff. Why that even happened, who the heck knows. But I think Ukraine did the right thing in '94, and then gradually it seems like Putin eroded that and looked at it as they didn't have very good nukes in the first place. They couldn't have done anything. We were in no real danger. And then, the U.S. just meddled. The rest of the world doesn't look at it that way. The rest of the world looks at it like things were signed in good faith, instigating conflict to erode an agreement and land grab. It's just the actions of a crazy imperialist. I have to say a crazy imperialist, because, there's kind of other ways to accomplish the same thing through corporate measures without the violence. But really, it seems like, I don't know if it's some sort of mystical magic attempt. I hate to trivialize it, but it's almost like the guy is kind of rebooting the Russian-Afghanistan, bloodiness. And I don't know if that was his intent, but the whole thing is just so goddamn strange. And, just so often in the beginning of it, I was always thinking back to Americans who lived through World War II, like, what exactly should be happening right now? What is the appropriate response? And, the response right now is, they have to do this measured thing. But the problem with the measured thing is, like, it's a waiting game. At what point are we going to start completely putting it out of our minds because it's too expensive? Meanwhile, it's no more expensive than walking into more traps. We're in this cyclic thing which grows the war machines. So it's perverse. It's a perverse timeline so far up to now. And I don't know if it's tenable. Like, I don't think we can keep The younger generations, I'm Generation X, look at the latter part of Generation X, not the early part. We just don't really have a taste for this crap. It's not entertaining. Like, there's a lot of stuff to do. I'm a person with significant disabilities. I'm not particularly bored. I might mouth off on topics online, this and that. You know, I'll try to add. I mean, there's always people to be leery of domestically. There's people shooting cinematographers like they're above the law. There's people getting out of child molestation allegations like they're above the law. And whether they're actually on the level people, it doesn't always seem that way. I mean, it doesn't seem so, you know, established that, these are individuals who are really worthy of exoneration, as in they're not up to no good. And there's a lot of people like that. It's not ethnic based. It's not religious based. There's people involved in incidents that look disturbing or that seem to sound disturbing, frequently in American culture. And there's corruption in government in various places. And American citizens are really very busy people in terms of trying to get accountability for that corruption in industries, in government, at the local level. There's just so many things. And you read about things such as, well, there's a new article on how traffic noise pollution affects heart disease. Well, cities should not be designed in such a way that contribute to heart disease. I mean, you can only do so much, but you can make laws around it, and then you can try to have your citizens adhere to those laws. I lived in Brooklyn. It was very difficult to live there due to the traffic noise, and that's prevalent throughout many American homes. You get some islands and you get some places where they're just living in close proximity that people will either be malicious with horns or they'll drive loud motorcycles. And this stuff, all engages the nervous system. And you have a lot of things that engage the nervous system and things that cause stress hormones and things like that. And it lowers quality of life. And we need to have a collective effort to emphasize health. And I'm not sure we do that. Emotional health and physical health. And we need to try to export that. They have that to some extent in Europe. We're lagging. We're behind Europe. We have our blessing is innovation. And Europe's blessing to some extent, is emotional maturity. But then they're also tolerant of things, it seems like, in terms of like pedophilia. Pedophilia is an affliction. It's a neurological affliction. Violating children is rape. A child can't consent. And, we have some fringe people that feel, no, we're failing as a race. If you want to have compassion for a person who has predispositions to abusing children sexually, well, rehabilitation needs to, or treatment, coping treatment and cognitive therapy are appropriate. But to endorse the lifestyle, and to some extent HBO and these media outlets to some extent have normalized some of this pedophilia now. And it's quite scary. And you see the depictions a little bit more in media than you used to. And culturally, some cultures have embraced, traditionally, some cultures have embraced, younger people having relations with older people in their 40s, when we're talking like 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds having relations with people in their 40s. It's just not appropriate. The legal consent age should be 18, 17, and then nothing under that should happen. And it's due to the fact that you would have older people. I'm in my 40s, and frankly, we're not the most hygienic people by the time we get to our 40s. By the time we get to our late 30s, 40s, we're now carriers, even if we're not particularly the most, what is the word? I always forget it. Well, we're not the most, sexually active people. It doesn't really matter, because just being exposed to so many viruses, not even in a sexual nature, just viruses, period, over decades, makes us carriers of different things. And such a person can't really, shouldn't impose upon minors. Even if there was no viral concern, it's still inappropriate for people past a certain age, 18. There's just a functional thing that it's been placed at. But it's not sanitary to have older people preying upon minors. It's gross. Our bodies are gross at this age. We've just picked up too much weird epigenetic things, and there should not be sexual intimacy with younger people. Even if they have a little better immune system, you're going to be introducing the viral epigenetic things into a younger population that all of a sudden they might be carriers for way longer. So it's not hygienic. I don't care if it was traditional. You also have to understand that in the old days, people in their 40s, going back thousands of years, people would die younger. People wouldn't really live, too far into their 60s and whatnot. They might die at a younger age. So it's very dangerous. We're getting into better hygiene, but, we've learned a little bit from recent pandemics and things like that. There's only so much sanitizer that really effectively does things, because viruses get into us and they eat our blood. they're living things, and we're hosts. So there's no real, to some extent you can mitigate viral infection, but once it's in the body, it's in the body, and whatever it does, I don't know. That's for epidemiologists to sort out, but it might become, we're just learning about the biome and things like that. So that stuff is all new, and we have to behave ourselves. I feel bad for somebody with destructive predispositions, but they are predispositions that are predatory in nature. It's not civil to target younger, minors for intimacy, like sexual intimacy. So, if there's a reckoning, then if there's pushback on that, or just that's going to be some sort of thing that's upheld, I don't know how that can end well. That seems like a problem. But anyway, I got a good sense of how my mic will work, I think, because I definitely ranted a long time. Party one.